The rain in Seattle never really stopped that year. It lingered in the air like a secret, quiet and persistent, soaking into the cracks of the old brick houses and the spaces between words that Claire and I no longer said to each other. I was 56, and after 27 years of marriage, I thought I could read every flicker in her eyes, every sigh, every silence. But that month something shifted. It began with a scent, something floral and unfamiliar that lingered on her scarf when she came home from work. Then it was the lipstick. A new shade, darker, bolder. At first, I told myself it was nothing. People change. Maybe she just wanted to feel young again. But as the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Claire grew distant. She started staying late at the high school where she taught literature. Grading papers, she'd say with that weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. And every night, her phone was glued to her hand, the soft glow of the screen lighting her face long after midnight. I noticed how quickly she locked it whenever I walked by. How she said just work stuff, a little too fast. The trust that once held us together began to tremble under the weight of tiny lies that didn't fit the rhythm of our life. One night, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom watching her from the reflection in the mirror. She was smiling at her phone. Not the polite smile she gave her students. Not the tired smile she gave me. This one was alive. Young. Dangerous. She looked up and saw me. "It's just an email from a parent," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, her tone casual, almost too casual. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But something inside me cracked, quiet as ice beneath the first step. Over the next few days, I found myself observing her the way an architect studies a structure he's afraid might collapse. The way she adjusted her perfume before leaving, the new music in her car playlist, the sudden interest in yoga on weekends she used to spend gardening. Then came the night I found a receipt in her coat pocket. A cafe in Tacoma. 2 cappuccinos. 2 pastries. The date matched one of her supposed teacher meetings. I stared at that small slip of paper under the kitchen light, and it felt heavier than stone. For the first time in my life, I didn't trust my wife. I sat in my studio that night, surrounded by unfinished sketches, the sound of rain tapping against the window. My pen hovered above the paper, but I wasn't designing a building. I was mapping out the ruins of my own home. That was when I made the call. Her name was Lisa Moreno, a private investigator based in Portland, recommended by an old client of mine. Her voice was calm, steady, professional. "You're not the first husband to ask," she said. I hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure I want to know," I admitted. Lisa's tone softened. "That's what everyone says. But truth has a way of showing up, whether you invite it or not." I gave her Claire's schedule, her workplace, the car model, everything. When I hung up, my hands were shaking. For the rest of that week, I went through the motions of daily life. Drafting blueprints, attending meetings, eating dinner beside Claire in silence. We lived like strangers sharing an address. On Friday, Lisa called. "Mr. James," she said, "I think you'll want to see this in person." My stomach dropped. I drove to her office downtown, the wipers cutting through a steady drizzle. Lisa greeted me with a manila folder and a sympathetic look. She didn't need to explain. The photos did it for her. Claire, my wife of 27 years, sitting across from a man at a cafe. Smiling, laughing. His hand brushed hers. Later, a picture of them entering a motel on the outskirts of Tacoma. Another of them leaving hours later, her hair slightly undone, his hand at the small of her back. The man was identified as Daniel Cooper, 44, a financial consultant. He lived 2 blocks away from us. 2 blocks. I stared at the evidence until my vision blurred. My chest felt tight as if the air had been stolen from the room. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the betrayal itself or how ordinary it looked on paper. Lisa placed a voice recorder on the table. "You don't have to listen," she said. But I did. Claire's voice came through, low and intimate. "I feel alive again when I'm with you, Daniel." Alive. The word echoed in my head as I drove home that night, the city lights streaking across the windshield like ghosts. I parked outside the house and sat there, listening to the rain. Inside, I could see her silhouette moving in the kitchen, pouring wine, humming softly to herself. And I realized the worst part wasn't the lie. It was that she looked happy. That night, for the first time, I didn't sleep beside her. I stayed in my studio, the folder on my desk, the rain outside whispering the truth I'd been too afraid to face. Tomorrow, I told myself I'll ask her. I'll look her in the eye and ask the question that's been burning in my throat. The following morning, everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Claire was in the kitchen, her back turned to me as she poured coffee into her favorite mug, the blue one with the small chip on the rim. The same mug she'd used for years, but I couldn't look at it without seeing those photographs in my head. Her laughter in that cafe. Her hands on another man's shoulders. She turned to me with a soft smile. "Morning. You were up late again. Working on that museum project." I nodded. My throat was too dry to speak. I sat across from her, pretending to read the paper while she scrolled through her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, her eyes glowing faintly with the light from the screen. When she noticed me watching, she smiled again, tight, uneasy, and set the phone down face down. In that instant, I knew there was no version of this conversation that wouldn't break us. The day dragged on. I went to the office, but my mind wasn't there. The sketches on my desk blurred together, lines turning to static. By noon I had made a decision. That night I drove to Tacoma. I told myself I wasn't going to follow her, but the lie was too easy to tell. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I parked across the street from the cafe Lisa had shown me in the photos. It was smaller than I imagined. The kind of place that smelled like roasted beans and quiet betrayals. I watched through the rain-streaked windshield as the evening crowd trickled in. At 6:42, Claire appeared. She was wearing a gray coat I'd given her for Christmas 3 years ago, her hair slightly curled. A few minutes later he arrived. Daniel Cooper. I recognized him instantly from the photographs, the confident posture, the carefully trimmed beard. He greeted her with that easy smile I used to think belonged only to me. She smiled back, the kind of smile that carried warmth and familiarity, like this wasn't the first time she'd done it. They talked for nearly an hour. I couldn't hear a word, but I didn't need to. Every gesture, every look, spoke louder than anything they could have said. At one point she reached across the table and touched his wrist. He didn't pull away. When they finally stood and left, I followed them at a distance. The rain had grown heavier and the night felt darker than usual. They drove together to the same motel Lisa had mentioned. A small, forgettable place by the highway with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. I parked across the street, engine running, headlights off. They got out, and for a brief moment, I saw her face as she laughed at something he said. She looked alive. Free. Beautiful. My chest tightened until I could barely breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, watching as they disappeared behind the motel door. The rain hammered against the windshield like a drumbeat counting down the end of my life as I knew it. I don't know how long I stayed there. Maybe an hour. Maybe 2. When she finally came out, her hair slightly tousled, she stood under the awning while Daniel spoke to her softly. She kissed him. It wasn't hurried or guilty. It was intimate, like they belonged to each other. I drove home in silence, every mile heavier than the last. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the road, wondering how something so ordinary could destroy everything I believed in. When I got home, Claire was already in bed. Her phone sat charging on the nightstand. I stood there for a long time, staring at her sleeping face. She looked peaceful. Innocent even. I wanted to wake her. To ask her why. But the words wouldn't come. I was afraid that if I opened my mouth, everything inside me would spill out and drown us both. Instead, I walked to my studio and poured myself a drink. The folder from Lisa lay on the table where I'd left it. I opened it again, photos, timestamps, notes. Proof of a life I hadn't known existed. I played the recording one more time. Her voice filled the room, low and trembling. You make me feel like myself again, Daniel. I pressed stop. The silence that followed was unbearable. That night I made another decision. I wasn't going to confront her with anger. I was going to end this quietly, methodically, like drafting the final blueprint of a building I'd spent decades constructing, only to realize it was never truly mine. Tomorrow night, when she comes home, I'll ask her the only question that matters. The house was silent that Friday night, the kind of silence that hums in your ears and makes you question whether you're still breathing. I sat alone in the living room, lights dimmed, a half-empty glass of whiskey resting on the table beside me. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, tapping against the window like a hesitant confession. Claire was late. Again. Her messages were the same as always, short, harmless, full of plausible excuses. Finishing up grading, she'd written an hour ago. But I knew better now. I'd seen the truth in photographs, heard it in her voice, felt it in the spaces between her words. I glanced at the clock. 9:17. My heart beat slow but heavy, like it was saving its strength for what was coming. On the coffee table lay the manila folder, opened and waiting. The photos were spread out. Her smile at the cafe, her hand in his, their faces inches apart under the flickering motel light. Evidence of another life she was living while I sat here, believing in ghosts. When the door finally opened, the hinges groaned like they too were tired of pretending. Claire stepped inside, shaking off her umbrella. She wore that same gray coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her hair slightly damp. For a fleeting second, she looked just like the woman I fell in love with, a familiar silhouette framed by the doorway of our home. "Hey," she said softly. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I answered. My voice came out lower than I expected. "I was waiting for you." She smiled, a little nervous. "You didn't have to. It's been a long day." "I know," I said. Then I gestured to the couch. "We need to talk." Her eyes flickered, confusion, or fear, passing through them. She hesitated but sat down across from me. I could see the pulse at her neck, quick and shallow. For a moment I just looked at her. At the woman who had shared my bed, my dreams, my entire adult life. The woman who once held my hand through every storm, who used to fall asleep on my shoulder after late-night movies. I wanted to remember her like that. Not like this. I took a slow breath. "Claire," I said quietly, "do you love him?" The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and final. She blinked, her face tightening. "What are you talking about?" "You know what I'm talking about." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "Daniel Cooper." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The color drained from her face. She stared at me as if the ground beneath her had disappeared. "Dylan, I didn't let her finish. I reached for the folder and turned it toward her. Photos slid across the table like falling leaves. Her laughter captured in still frames. Her hand on his arm. The motel. She froze, eyes darting from picture to picture. Her hands trembled as she gathered them, as if she could somehow piece the story back together differently. "I can explain," she whispered. "Can you?" I asked. Tears welled in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I was lonely, Dylan. You were always working, always somewhere else. I felt invisible." "Daniel," he listened. "He made me feel like myself again." Her words were knives disguised as apologies. I sat there, numb, watching her crumble under the weight of her own guilt. "You made a choice," I said finally. "You didn't trip into his arms by accident." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. "Please don't do this. We can fix it. I'll end it. I swear." I pulled my hand back. "You already ended it." The silence that followed was suffocating. She sobbed quietly, burying her face in her hands. I stood up, walked to the window, and stared out at the rain-soaked street. Everything we'd built, the laughter, the routines, the quiet mornings, it all felt like a house made of glass, shattered in an instant. When I turned back, she was still crying. "I'm sorry," she said again, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry too," I replied, though I wasn't sure for what. For not seeing it sooner? For believing love was enough? For still caring even now? I gathered the photos and placed them back into the folder. "Tomorrow," I said, "I'm calling my lawyer." Her head shot up, eyes wide. "Dylan, please don't do this. Think of the kids. Think of—" "I am thinking of them," I interrupted. "They deserve to know that betrayal has consequences." She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You'll ruin me." I met her gaze, calm and unflinching. "You already ruined us." I walked out of the living room, leaving her alone among the wreckage of our marriage. In the hallway, I paused by the family photos, the ones where we all looked happy, untouched by the cruel simplicity of real life. I almost reached out to take one down, but I didn't. Let them stay, I thought. Let them remind me of the difference between what was real and what was only a picture. Upstairs, I packed a small bag and moved into the guest room. The rain outside grew heavier, drowning out her muffled sobs. That night I didn't dream. I just lay there, eyes open, waiting for morning. Waiting for the part where I stopped feeling anything at all. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday morning, beneath a sky the color of steel. There were no arguments left, no accusations, no fight. Only silence, the kind that settles after something breaks beyond repair. Claire didn't look at me much during the proceedings. She sat on the other side of the long wooden table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her wedding ring already gone. When the judge stamped the final document, it was like the sound of a door closing. 27 years of marriage reduced to ink and paper. Afterward, I drove home for the last time. The house on Cedar Hill had become nothing but a memory wrapped in drywall and ghosts. I walked through each room slowly, the kitchen where we used to argue about burnt toast, the hallway lined with pictures of our kids, Noah and Emily, when they still thought love lasted forever. The living room was the hardest. That was where I'd asked her the question. Where I'd watched the life drain out of everything we'd built. I stood there for a long moment, then turned off the lights and closed the door behind me. By the end of the week, the house was sold. My things fit into the back of a moving truck. Blueprints, a camera, a few clothes, and a box of old letters I couldn't throw away. I didn't take the wedding album. She could keep it. I drove east for 2 days across the flat stretches of Idaho and into Colorado. The air grew thinner, cleaner, colder. Boulder sat nestled beneath the mountains, quiet and small compared to Seattle, but it felt like exactly what I needed, a place that didn't know my story. I rented a small cabin on the edge of town. The first night there, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the outline of the Rockies beneath a violet sky. For the first time in months, I breathed without feeling like my lungs were full of glass. The mornings came slow after that. I started hiking again, something I hadn't done since the kids were little. The mountain trails were brutal but honest. They demanded your full attention. You couldn't think about the past when the path beneath you kept shifting with every step. Eventually, I joined a local photography club. I had always loved capturing buildings and lines, but now my lens turned toward the wild. The jagged peaks, the way the light cut through the clouds, the sound of wind brushing through the trees. There was peace in that silence, in the distance between me and everything I left behind. It was during one of those early morning hikes that I met her, Grace Mitchell. She was standing on a ridge overlooking the valley, a camera in her hands, her blonde hair tied loosely beneath a wool cap. She smiled when she noticed me. "You chasing the light too?" she asked. I chuckled softly. "Always." We talked for a while about shutter speeds and landscapes, the kind of easy conversation that didn't need history. Later, over coffee at a small diner in town, I learned she was a landscape photographer who'd lost her husband in a plane crash 2 years earlier. Her grief had driven her to the mountains just like mine. We didn't flirt. We didn't promise anything. We just talked. 4 hours. About loss, about silence, about how the world keeps turning even when yours stops. Over the next few weeks, we kept meeting, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. We hiked the same trails, shared the same thermos of coffee, and laughed about how both of us pretended we were fine. She had a calm presence, like standing next to a river that never judged you for where you'd been. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, she said, "You don't talk much about her." I paused. "There's not much left to say." Grace nodded. "Then maybe it's time to stop carrying her." Her words stayed with me long after she left that night. Maybe she was right. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning how to stop bleeding. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, Claire's world was falling apart. I'd heard through a mutual friend that she'd been suspended from her teaching job after the scandal reached the school board. The board labeled her unprofessional conduct. Students whispered. Colleagues avoided her. She'd moved to Spokane, renting a small apartment downtown, taking whatever teaching job she could find. The kids, Noah and Emily, stayed with me during breaks, their visits quieter now, their laughter edged with something uncertain. They still loved their mother, but they didn't understand her choices. Neither did I. One night, Emily called her and came back crying. I didn't ask what was said. Some answers don't heal, they only reopen the wound. In Boulder, I found small joys again. Fresh snow on the porch, the smell of pine after rain, the sound of Grace's laughter echoing against the cliffs. Life didn't feel full, but it felt possible. Sometimes, when the wind swept down from the mountains, I thought of Claire. Not with hate. Not even with sadness. Just a distant ache, like a song I used to love but couldn't listen to anymore. I didn't know if forgiveness was coming. I just knew I wasn't waiting for it. The morning air at Rocky Mountain National Park carried a chill sharp enough to wake the soul. Frost glazed the edges of the trail, and each breath rose like smoke in the thin light. I hiked slowly, camera slung over my shoulder, Grace walking a few steps ahead. The sun was still hiding behind the peaks, waiting for its cue to rise. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The silence between us had grown comfortable, like a language we both understood. The trail wound upward, cutting through a forest of pines that whispered softly in the wind. Every step felt like distance from my old life, from the man I used to be, the one who'd measured love in blueprints and vows, who thought trust was indestructible. Halfway up, Grace stopped to adjust her camera. "Light's perfect," she said. I followed her gaze. The sky was turning a deep orange, spilling across the horizon like molten metal. I lifted my own camera, focusing on the moment the first beam of sunlight touched the snow-covered ridge. The world seemed suspended, quiet, weightless, infinite. When I lowered the lens, Grace was watching me. "You look lighter," she said softly. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." We reached the summit just as the sun broke free. The copper glow washed over us, painting the rocks, the trees, and the valley below in a light so alive it almost hurt to look at. I set my pack down and just stood there, letting the warmth sink into me. For a long while we didn't speak. Then I said, "You ever wonder why pain feels heavier than happiness?" Grace thought for a moment. "Because pain demands to be carried. Happiness just asks to be noticed." Her answer settled in my chest, gentle and true. I realized I'd spent so many months dragging the past behind me like a shadow that I'd forgotten to notice the light right in front of me. She stepped closer. "You don't owe her forgiveness, you know?" "I know," I said. "But maybe I owe it to myself." Grace smiled, her eyes reflecting the sunrise. "That's the right kind of forgiveness." I laughed softly, the sound echoing through the quiet mountain air. It felt strange, how laughter could still find its way back after everything. As we started our descent, I glanced one last time at the horizon. For the first time I didn't think of Claire. I didn't think of what was lost or broken. I thought about this moment, the mountain, the light, the woman walking beside me, and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat reminding me I was still here. Miles away, in a small apartment in Spokane, Claire sat by her window, the gray winter light falling across her face. The city outside was quiet, indifferent. On her desk lay an open journal, pages filled with regret, crossed-out apologies, and fragments of the life she'd destroyed. She wrote one final line, "I lost him, but worse, I lost myself." Then she closed the book. The wind outside her window carried faint traces of snow, the kind that falls without warning, soft and endless. Somewhere beyond those clouds, the same sun that rose over the Rockies was shining above her too. But our stories were no longer the same. As Grace and I reached the base of the trail, the light turned gold and the world seemed to exhale. I raised my camera one last time, capturing the day's first full breath. I didn't say it out loud, but I felt it deep inside, the quiet truth I'd spent months trying to reach. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find who you really are. And in that moment, under the copper sky, I finally did.